Hi, Maurice. Thanks for joining me. My name is Courtney Alexander, and we wanted to get you on here to talk through with Foxwell Digital about a split test that you ran. But first, I want to kind of introduce you. Tell us who you are, what you do, and then we'll jump into the split test that you ran.
Sure. My name is Maurice Rahmey. I am the co-founder of an agency called Disruptive Digital that I started 2.5 years ago with my business partner. We both worked at Facebook prior for about 6 or 7 years each. And our goal is to work with clients that are trying to scale their businesses as long as they have some sort of an end goal. So for the most part, we're working with a lot of e-commerce businesses and subscription businesses. And generally speaking, the types of clients that we're working with are spending anywhere between $100,000 a month on the low end to $750,000 a month on the higher end per client.
Awesome. So you posted a tweet thread that really excited us and made us want to talk to you about it. So you ran a split test, but it was for testing ROAS for customer acquisition at scale. And so you did a split test to understand the impact of a larger budget in the same environment. So test one was what you mentioned in the Twitter thread was the normal budget. And then the second test was where you increased the budget by more than 60%. Can you kind of, from a broad perspective, kind of explain this test and what made you want to do it and kind of give us a little bit more insight into the test itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally speaking, when we're working with businesses that we take on that might be spending a little bit less, a lot of the times the client will say, we have a 4x return on ad spend or some very high return on ad spend. But generally speaking, what that means is that they're going after a very, qualified audience of people that, have already been to the site, or sometimes they're burying in existing customers. And so those numbers look really, really good. And then on top of that, a lot of the times they would have gotten those sales anyways. And in reality, the best way to kind of look at Facebook is not necessarily to think about it from what's the highest return on ad spend I can get, but more so, how can I scale as much as possible? Because while you're getting a lower return on ad spend, and you're making less per customer, theoretically speaking, you end up making more money overall by focusing on going after volume. And so realistically, part of the way that we can kind of show this to clients is, sometimes you'll see a client come in and, they have like a 3x return on ad spend, but they've barely spent anything because it's really hard to hit that number. And then you kind of look at the margins and back into the numbers and see that, they made $5,000 on that particular effort last month and drove 100 customers. And instead of saying to them, hey, we're making, $5,000 in profit and 100 customers, what about if we could look at this differently? And instead of making $5,000 with 100 customers, we make $5,000 in profit with 1,000 customers. And most people, when they hear that, are like, yeah, that actually makes sense, because at the end of the day, I'm still making the same amount of money, but I'm bringing in 10x the amount of people that I was prior. And so we're trying to kind of reposition to people how they think about the idea of profit, from profit per customer to overall profit. And when they start to think about it that way, it allows us to kind of look at the goals that we're kind of achieving in a different way. Because at the end of the day, if we can show that we can scale, we can help you grow your business a lot quicker than if we were, playing around with smaller investment amounts. I'll stop there. Any questions on that?
No, that sounds great. I have some more questions for you, but that part sounds great.
Okay.
But one of the things I wanted to ask, could you talk a little bit about the seasonality and the auction dynamics that you discussed in your tweet, specifically expanding upon what testing during different months and seasons may look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the important thing to understand is, with this particular account that we were working with, we had a situation where our budget was capped. They had a very high ROAS goal, but instead of kind of taking a situation where they would, say like, all right, as long as we're getting like a 2x, continue to invest, they looked at it and said, all right, this month we're going to do 50,000. The next month we're going to do 100,000. And it was always like these incremental dollars that were kind of growing. And one of the challenges when you think about that is they were, a client can look at that and say, oh, well, we doubled the budget, right? And the return on ad spend was cut in half. But the problem with that approach is that you're not taking into account seasonality, right? If you're spending $50,000 in November and then spend $100,000 in December, right? You're going to have a situation where, of course, the performance might look worse in November when Black Friday, Cyber Monday aren't happening. And so as a result, you're not taking into account the seasonality that sometimes happens with businesses. And so realistically, the only way to understand how an increased budget is going to help you grow is by running it simultaneously in its own environment compared to the budgets that you want to spend. Because if you don't do that, you're always going to focus on correlation versus, in this case, what should be causation.
Got it. Super interesting. So the specific split test that you run, how did you set it up and how did you make sure that you weren't competing against yourself in the same account?
Yeah, so we actually brought this idea to the Facebook team because we felt that there was a lot of opportunity to grow. And so we worked with the marketing science team to kind of build this out. However, at the same time, there was no need for us to kind of work with the Facebook team to make this happen, because a lot of the ways that this could have been done through just like the self-serve split tools that Facebook has. And so in reality, the biggest component here is not necessarily just running two different budgets and comparing them. You have to have two mutually exclusive environments. And so, whatever you're running in cell A has to be exactly the same in cell B. And so we kind of took that approach of saying, all right, in cell A, we're going to have this level of prospecting and this level of, this type of video. And then in cell B, we're going to do the same thing, except instead what we're going to do is we're going to ratchet up the budget by 60% and understand how that's impacting the performance. And we didn't necessarily look at it and say, this got a 2x and this got a 3x. And so if we spend twice as much, we're going to get a 3x. It was looked at in terms of relative performance, right? And so if you're going from a 2x to a 3x in that particular month, it's based on the percentage. So I guess in that case, it would be like, we increased the ROAS by 50%, by spending X dollars more. So the entire time that we were focusing on the situation and bringing it to the client, it wasn't saying if you spend X, you will get this return on ad spend. It was saying if we spend this percent more, we expect that, you'll get this, this type of CPA or this type of ROAS. It's always done in relative terms.
Got it. Super interesting. So I guess stepping out of the test just a little bit, if let's say in the future in a hypothetical situation, a client does agree that they're okay with that lower ROAS, how would you suggest they scale?
So I think it comes down to kind of what I was saying at the beginning, which is to look at what the numbers are prior to starting and saying, all right, if we're getting $5,000 today in profit on a 3x return on ad spend, you're okay with getting $5,000 in profit, right? Like you never had any issues with getting the $5,000 in profit prior. And so if that's the number that you're okay with, we should back out the numbers to try and figure out and project what would allow us to still get the $5,000 that you're okay with in profit. But instead of aiming for getting that with lower spend and a higher profit per customer, instead what we should do is focus on how do we do that with volume, right? Because at the end of the day, if we're acquiring new customers at the same rate, you're still making the same amount of money. In the long term, you're going to end up making more on the lifetime value. You're still making the same upfront, but now you have a lot more upside and opportunity to make more a couple weeks later, a month later, a few months later, because that the lifetime value might be there.
Got it. Interesting. So, and going back to the point about seasonality and making sure we're running these tests at the same time, obviously there's anything that can happen in terms of seasonality. Do you think all seasons or times of year are good for this type of scaling, or should you avoid times like Black Friday, Cyber Monday, holiday season, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the end of the day, you have to go into the test knowing two things. The test is not indicative of the results, at any point or let me rephrase it. The test is indicative of results relatively, right? So if you were to spend twice as much at this time of the year and you get a 50% higher, or lower ROAS, it's going to probably be the same like a month later, right? What does change though is that level of performance, right? And so we spoke about that idea of seasonality earlier, where if you, kind of ran this test in November, you might get different results than if you ran it in December. And so I would say that there's two components. So anytime that you run a test, a split test or a lift test, you are going to get worse performance because of the fact that you're doing one of two things or both of these. In a holdout test, you're suppressing part of your audience. And so if you do that, you're essentially, instead of reaching 100% of your target audience, maybe you're reaching 80%. And when you do that, your CPMs are going to rise because your supply of people that you can reach are going to be, more cost prohibitive, right? And so you're not actually reaching the entire environment. Same thing with the split test, right? If you're going to take 50% of an audience and give them one budget, and 50% of your audience and give them another budget, you're not actually working within the normal Facebook environment to get the types of results that you might expect. And so you have to go in knowing that you're going to get worse performance, and you're ultimately just measuring the relative success between cell A and cell B. And so as a result, you have to think through when is the optimal time to kind of run a test like this. And it doesn't make sense to do this during like your top sales period. I would say that it makes sense to do this to prepare for your top sales period, right? Like if you don't believe that Facebook should work with scale, you want to kind of get this set up in advance of Black Friday or Cyber Monday. That's probably the best time to do it, because that way, at least you're not going to lose out on that opportunity a month or 2 months later. There's really no wrong time to do it, but I would say that, you want to do it in preparation for when you're actually going to have the best results possible in a uncontrolled environment versus in this test environment.
Got it. So I know we talked about how the overall revenue is going to increase even if your ROAS goes down. But how did you make your client agree to the test, likely knowing or hypothesizing that their CPA would increase, ROAS might decrease? How are they okay with being like the guinea pig for a test?
Yeah, so in this particular situation, I think there's two components to that. I think you have to kind of take the bet and say, we need to do this so that way that we can grow the business. And if we don't do this, we're never going to get to where you need to be. And, for us, when we take on an account, we need to know that we're going to be able to get them to where they need to go and manage those expectations. I think that just comes down to like an agency component of just managing those expectations. We wouldn't have worked with this account if we didn't believe that they were going to sign on to this. And so we were aligned from the beginning that this would work. What we did though is we actually felt that we should be accelerating the velocity of new customer acquisition. And so we actually reached out to our Facebook rep to try and get bonus dollars to offset theoretically running this test, right? Because if we could get the bonus dollars as a way to incentivize them to do this, it would give them less of a reason to not. And so in this particular situation, we knew that if we could get ahead of it and say, like, if we can get you, I'm making this up, like $20,000 in bonus dollars, then there's really no reason to be concerned, because at the end of the day, you're still getting bonus dollars to kind of offset the costs. I think outside of that, though, it just comes down to kind of managing those expectations and letting them know that if you want to do this, like, you are going to get worse results for, the duration of the test, which might be 3 to 6 weeks. But the idea is we're going to come out of it and it's going to be better for you in the long run.
Got it. Super interesting. Are there any other challenges or intricacies or nuances that you faced during the split test?
Yeah, I think our performance wasn't, in gross terms, wasn't where we wanted it to be, which is what you just discussed. Like, we weren't getting the results that we needed to necessarily get, but they were well under what we thought they were going to be. Like, we expected dips, but we didn't expect the dips that we got. And so what ended up happening was we got the results that we wanted, not in terms of running the test for the full, I think, 5 weeks that we had originally proposed. But after 3 weeks, the client had seen enough that they knew that, like, this was the right direction to go in, right? And ultimately, that was what the test was about. It wasn't necessarily about, waiting 5 weeks to kind of see what would happen. The goal was for them to believe that, like, this was the right approach. And so in this particular situation, like, it was more than enough time, and it was still statistically significant that we could move forward with it. I think, did that impact our ability to run tests in the future? Yes and no. I think we're still going to be able to do them. I think that the expectations we will set will be lower than what happened this time around. But I think other than that, generally speaking, everything was kind of managed as expected.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you definitely want to share that was interesting about the split test, so that would help other ad buyers or other people wanting to run split tests? Is there anything else that you wanted to add that maybe I haven't asked yet?
Yeah, I think anytime you run a split test or a holdout or do any sort of experiment, you just want to make sure that you're kind of going in with the hypothesis and not just kind of testing for testing's sake. I think sometimes that happens. If you have like a big sweeping idea, it's really worth it to split test, because you don't want to say that some sort of component that you're doing works when in reality, again, it might be that idea of like causation, like correlation, where it's just because you did it during this time period, versus causation, where it might actually be some change that you made that had that impact. And I think sometimes, people mistake correlation for causation when that's really not the case, or like they test things that aren't actually going to be meaningful for the business. You have to kind of go in with these big hypotheses if you're going to do it. And small tests are not going to grow a business as much as kind of thinking through like these big sweeping tests, like thinking about increasing investment by 60 or 70%.
Got it. Awesome. Well, that's all the questions I had for you today. Thank you so much for joining us and for talking through this. And I'm sure if anyone has questions, are they able to reach out to you on Twitter?
Sure.
That's probably the best way.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Cool.